All right, I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center here in New York City, pulling away from CBS Mornings Plus so we can bring you this. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy now addressing the UN General Assembly after hailing Donald Trump's big shift on the war with Russia. Let's listen.
Work on weapons. It's sick, but that's the reality. Not international law, not cooperation. Weapons decide who survives. Excellencies, you know perfectly well international law doesn't work fully unless you have powerful friends who are truly willing to stand up for it. And even that doesn't work without weapons. It's terrible, but without it, things would be even worse. There are no security guarantees except friends and weapons. No Ukrainian choice this kind of reality. And knowing our people, they would have chosen a different priority. Ukrainians are peaceful people, but they are people who want to live freely in their own independent country. That's why we invest in defense. For many nations, there is simply no other way left. Nations can speak about their pain from stages like this, but even during bloodshed, there isn't a single international institution that can truly stop it. That's how weak these institutions have become. What can Sudan or Somalia or Palestine or any other people living through war really expect from the UN or the global system? For decades, just statements and statements. And even everything happening in Gaza remains without a way out. Even now, Syria, after all the changes, still has to appeal to the world to ease the sanctions that are choking its economy. It has to ask and wait. Syria deserves stronger support from the international community. And as Russia's war against my country goes on, people are still dying every week. Yet there is no ceasefire because Russia refuses. Russia abducted thousands of Ukrainian children, and we have brought some of them back. And I thank everyone who's helped. But how long will it take to bring all of them home? Childhood slips away faster than adults are able to help. Look at Israel. Nearly 2 years have passed and hostages still haven't been freed. They must be freed, but even that still hasn't happened. And for years, there have been no real answers to other threats, either chemical weapons and famine used as a weapon. Last year, at this assembly, I warned the world about the risk of radiation disasters, especially due to Russia's occupations of our Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, but nothing's changed, nothing's. And yesterday, the plant went into blackout again, and Russia hasn't stopped shelling even in areas near a nuclear facility. And because of international institutions are too weak, this madness continues. Even being part of a long-standing military alliance doesn't automatically mean you are safe. Just recently, 19 simple Russian drones violated Polish airspace, and only 4 were shut down. Luckily, they were not shaheeds or even worse. Otherwise, the results would have been horrific. Estonia had to call a UN Security Council meeting for the first time in history because Russian fighter jets deliberately entered its airspace. Moldova is defending itself, again, from Russia's interference. We are helping Moldova, and Russia's trying to do to Moldova what Iran once did to Lebanon. And the global response, again, not enough. We have already lost Georgia in Europe. Human rights and the European nature of the state system are only shrinking there. Georgia is dependent on Russia. And for many, many years, Belarus has also been moving toward dependence on Russia. Europe cannot afford to lose Moldova too. It's important to remember how the world once ignored the need to help Georgia after Russia's attack, and how the moment was missed with Belarus. How Moldova must not be lost. And for Europe, supporting Moldova's stability is not costly, but failing to do so will come at a much higher price. That's why the EU needs to help Moldova now with funding and energy support, not just words or political gestures. We must not forget about protecting the rights of people and the rights of nations in regions where these rights are under threat. The UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights must apply everywhere. But the Taliban in Afghanistan dragged a whole country back into the dark ages. Cartels in some Latin America countries are more powerful than the government there. This is all about collapse of international law and the weakness of the international institutions. And so it's about the rise of weapons. Weapons decide who survives. Excellencies, yesterday President Trump stood right here in this hall, and God saved him from a murder attempt during the campaign. A shot was fired from a rifle, and just a fraction of an inch saved his life. Just days ago, President, along with hundreds of thousands of Americans, honored the memory of Charlie Kirk. Sadly, his life was cut short by a bullet. Once again, violence with a rifle in hand. We also mourn the Ukrainian woman, Irina Zarutska. She was brutally killed with a knife here in America, the very country where she was seeking refuge from Russia's war. And almost every day when we open the news, we see headlines about violent attacks happening all around the world. Most of it is done with weapons. People are already used to, but weapons are evolving faster than our ability to defend ourselves. Now, there are tens of thousands of people who know how to professionally kill using drones. Stopping that kind of attack is harder than stopping any gun, knife, or bomb. This is what Russia has brought with its war. It used to be that only the strongest countries could use drones because they were expensive and complex. Now, even simple drones can fly thousands of kilometers. War tech doesn't care about geography anymore. It's now reshaping it. Just recently, airports in Europe had to shut down because of drones. Authorities couldn't even say what kind of drones they were, who sent them, or from where. Last week, North Korea announced the test of a tactical strike drone. That means even countries with limited resources can now build weapons that are dangerous to their neighbors. Ukraine and nations like Saudi Arabia know all too well how dangerous Iranian attack drones are. But what happens when all the types of drones become available, even to small terrorist groups or cartels? The world moves too slowly to protect itself, and weapons move fast. Now companies are already working on drones that can shoot down other drones, and it's only a matter of time, not much, before drones are fighting drones, attacking critical infrastructure, and targeting people all by themselves, fully autonomous, and no human involved, except the few who control AI systems. Dear leaders, we are now living through the most destructive arms race in human history, because this time includes artificial intelligence. And if there are no real security guarantees except friends and weapons, And if the world can't respond even to old threats, and if there is no strong platform for international security, will there be any place left on Earth that's still safe for people? We need global rules now for how AI can be used in weapons, and this is just as urgent as preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. We need to restore international cooperation, real working cooperation for peace and for security. A few years from now might already be too late. 10 years ago, war looked different, and no one imagined that cheap drones could create dead zones, areas stretching for dozens of kilometers where nothing moves, no vehicles, no life. People used to imagine that only after a nuclear strike. Now it's drawn reality. Mass-produced, simple drones, and without AI yet. Ukraine doesn't have the big fat missiles dictators love to show off in parades, but we do have drones that can fly up to 2,000–3,000 kilometers. We had no choice but to build them to protect our right to life. Control over the sea used to depend on having a big navy. Ukraine doesn't have a big fleet, but we succeeded. In the Black Sea, we pushed what's left of the Russian navy into a remote base. And we did it with sea drones. That's how we protect our ports and maritime trade routes, because Russia has left us no other choice. And our spiderweb operation, when cheap drones destroyed or damaged dozens of expensive Russian strategic bombers, became a real example for special forces around the world of what new weapons can do to old systems. These very Russian bombers attacked our cities. And none of this would have happened if Putin had not started this full-scale aggression, full-scale war. And every year that this war goes on, weapons become even more deadly. And only Russia deserves to be blamed for this. Dear leaders, to protect lives, Ukraine builds underground schools and underground hospitals. To protect lives, we have to spend more on protecting power stations from drone and missile attacks than on building sports facilities or cultural infrastructure. Ukrainian farmers are learning how to protect their equipment from Russia's FPV drone strikes, and for them, that challenge is far greater than climate change. Russia's war has put us in this situation, but do you have protection against similar threats? The facts are simple. Stopping this war now, and with it, the global arms race, is cheaper than building underground kindergartens or massive bunkers for critical infrastructure later. Stopping Putin now is cheaper than trying to protect every port and every ship from terrorists with sea drones. Stopping Russia now is cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead. So we must use everything we have together to force the aggressor to stop. And only then do we have a real chance that this arms race will not end in catastrophe for all of us. If it takes weapons to do it, if it takes pressure on Russia, then it must be done. And it must be done now. Otherwise, Putin will keep driving the war forward wider and deeper. And we told you before, Ukraine is only the first, and now Russian drones are already flying across Europe, and Russian operations are already spreading across countries, and Putin wants to continue this war by expanding it, and no one can feel safe right now. So first, we are now building a new security architecture for ourselves. More than 30 countries are already part of our coalition, and we are strengthening army, launching joint weapons production with partners, and defining financial commitments for defense in a way that could become a security model for any other nation. If security guarantees work for Ukraine something more than just friends and weapons, it will mean that people were able to make national security not a privilege for a few nations, but a right for everyone. Second, we are ready to make our modern weapons become your modern security, your modern weapon. And we have decided to open up arms exports. And these are powerful systems tested in a real war when every international institution failed. And we are also ready to grow our defense production together with strong partners so that their protection is modern and reliable. You don't need to start this race from scratch. We're ready to share what has already proven itself in real defense. And third, many in the world are still relaxed. Still. But look at how many countries are here at this General Assembly, countries that are at war, or just came out of war, or are trying to stop one, or openly getting ready for one. War has already reached too many people to pretend it has nothing to do with you. So it depends on you. Whether you help peace or continue trading with Russia and helping Russia to fund this war, it depends on you. Whether prisoners of war will be freed, whether abducted children will come home, whether hostages will be free, it depends on you. What will define existence? War like now, or our joint strong actions as it should be? Yesterday we had a good meeting with President Trump, and I also spoke with many other strong leaders, and together we can change a lot. Of course, we are doing everything to make sure Europe truly helps. And of course, we count on the United States. I appreciate the support we are receiving. Yes, much depends on the G7 and G20, but in the end, peace depends on all of us, on the United Nations. So don't stay silent while Russia keeps dragging this war on. Please speak out and condemn it. Please join us in defending life and international law and order. People are waiting for action. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à
All right,
remercier.
you've been listening to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressing the United Nations. President Zelenskyy praised Donald Trump's, quote, big shift on the war with Russia. He also, in his remarks, condemned the war in Gaza, saying the global response to ending both wars is not enough. We're going to get very soon to our team coverage of this event this morning. For you, we've got all of our correspondents in position. And one of the things that was remarkable to hear over the last 24 hours is President Zelenskyy referencing his meetings with President Trump yesterday, where the President of the United States signaled a very different approach to the war in Ukraine than he had been suggesting over the last couple of months. You'll recall a few weeks ago, the President of the United States rolled out the red carpet, the proverbial red carpet for Russian leader Vladimir Putin, believing that an impending ceasefire or even peace deal was possible. Vladimir Putin responded to that meeting by launching more attacks on Ukraine, more drone attacks, more missile attacks, and in recent weeks had even started to provoke some of his Eastern European neighbors with drone incursions or aircraft incursions into NATO allies like Poland. The President of the United States yesterday suggesting that these aircraft, he was in agreement that if they entered into friendly territory, in other words, NATO territory, when asked the question, should, for example, Poland be able to shoot those aircraft out of the sky, the president indicated that he was supportive of that. Again, very, very big signal change from the president of the United States. And he also went even further in a series of posts on Truth Social, where he indicated that Vladimir Putin was nothing but a paper tiger. So let's get you to Sam Vinograd. Thanks, Sam Vinograd. Let's get you to Sam Vinograd, who's a national security contributor here at CBS News. Always great to talk to you, Sam, for your insight and analysis. So let's unwind what I was sort of getting into there. The big change in tone from President Trump. And one of the things that he indicated after months of suggesting that this wasn't possible, he now says, the president, that Ukraine can actually win back some of that territory that Russia has sort of annexed in their attempt to take over the entire country. What does that mean to you? What does that signal?
Well, Donald Trump is certainly signaling that he's willing to abandon one of his signature foreign policy principles, which is that Ukraine has to give up at least some of the territory that Russia has seized. That's about 20% of Ukrainian territory. But Vlad, candidly, I am less focused on what President Trump says and more focused on what he does. President Trump's comments on how to end the carnage in Ukraine have really been a roller coaster since he came into office. His relationship with Zelenskyy has had a low point in February during that horrific Oval Office meeting. When he met with President Putin in Alaska just, I believe, 5 weeks ago, he warmed up to President Putin and then launched seemingly a course of negotiations between the two leaders, perhaps a trilateral summit. And now, 5 weeks later at the United Nations, President Trump seems to be siding more with Ukraine and with where NATO has been for the past several years. So he's saying the right things when it comes to Ukrainian sovereignty and international law. But the question is whether he is going to be willing to commit additional U.S. security assistance, U.S. security guarantees, and more U.S. military assets so that Ukraine can win back that territory and signal to Russia that they need to stop their illegal onslaught.
Sam, before I let you go, let me just ask you about the other sort of big news that the president made yesterday, and I sort of referenced it, which was when he was asked directly if our NATO allies should have the right to shoot down any kind of aircraft, whether drone or otherwise, entering into their airspace. The president said yes, that he supports that. What does that mean if you are Poland, for example? I mean, the president of the United States, as one of the most powerful men on the planet, suggesting that it's okay. Do you take him at his word that it is okay to do that?
No, I think there's specific protocols within NATO for how they respond to various Russian activities. There has been a range of scenario planning within NATO since it was created decades ago, and certainly based upon the illegal Russian incursions into Poland, into Estonia, and perhaps potentially into other Baltic states. NATO allies are carefully practicing their operational plans for a range of scenarios.
All right, Sam Vinograd for us this morning. Sam, always great to chat with you. Folks, we're going to also talk to CBS News Intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis, but we just want to update you on that situation that we've been monitoring out of Dallas, Texas, where we understand that a shooter has killed two individuals. And again, these numbers are coming into us. The situation is still very fluid at an ICE detention facility in Dallas, Texas. The shooter is dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. We are covering that story. Our Omar Villafranca is heading to the scene right now. We're going to have a lot more on that throughout the course of this hour and in the next couple of hours. But just want to update you on that again. There's been a shooting at an ICE detention facility in Dallas, Texas. We understand that the shooter has taken his own life. We understand that two people, possibly more, we don't know the full details yet, have also been killed in that attempt to disrupt activities at the detention facility. We also know that the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has tweeted about this, suggesting that just what I reported, that two people have been killed, the shooter dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So we're going to get a lot more information in the minutes, hours, days ahead. So just want to update you on that. Let's continue this discussion about what's happening right here in New York City, the UN General Assembly here. I want to bring in CBS News Intelligence and National Security reporter Olivia Gazis, who's here in New York City at the United Nations. Olivia, let me ask you for your takeaways from President Zelensky's speech this morning.
Sure, Vlad. It was a packed room. He received a lot of applause at the conclusion of his remarks, and they were really broad and very bleak, painting a picture of a war landscape that has become automated, that has become ridden by drones, that has forced Ukraine to build its schools underground, that has taken a drastic toll on the country, and painting also international institutions as ineffective. He's joining a chorus of leaders, including President Trump, who have said that the UN has failed to protect the most vulnerable people in the world, including Palestinians in Gaza, including Syrians in Syria, by not lifting crippling sanctions that have been in place on the country for as long as they have been. The Syrian leader is expected to address the UN in just a couple of hours later here today. But President Zelenskyy making the case that more needs to be done, saying that the world is moving too slowly in order to protect its most vulnerable. Of course, he thanked President Trump, as you noted, for that big shift. The question is, as you were just discussing with Sam Vinograd, how permanent that shift in tone actually is, and whether it's actually accompanied by any material action.
Yeah, and so, Olivia, the same question sort of to you that we were talking about with Sam, which is, the President of the United States yesterday signaling a very different approach to the war in Ukraine. Has there been any reaction at all from the Russians as to what President Trump, not only what he said yesterday to reporters, but also what he posted on Truth Social?
Yes, the Russians are treating this as temporary. They think it's sort of a passing cloud over the relationship that they have with President Trump. They dismissed his comments, accusing them of being potentially a paper tiger, saying Russia is a bear. There's no such thing as a paper bear. That's the spokesman for the Kremlin saying those things. And they are continuing to double down on their military campaign in Russia. So, yes, as remarkable as President Trump's statement was, as almost unsolicited as it was, it didn't include any concrete U.S. commitment. In fact, at the end of it, he wished both countries well, as though there was sort of an ambivalence as to which one won out. Apart from putting more stock in Ukraine's chances, there wasn't a clear U.S. investment that he was articulating in that statement. And Zelenskyy himself later admitted to being a little bit surprised by the shift in tone, very grateful for it. He told reporters that he met with afterward that he was glad that President Trump had good information, and he called him a game changer in the course of his conflict if he chose to act. We know that this is coming amid a spate of Russian incursions into NATO airspace with drones, with aircraft. We know that the Russians have been pushing the boundaries and testing NATO's response. What remains to be seen is whether those now continue, given President Trump yesterday said that his relationship with Vladimir Putin didn't mean anything.
All right, Olivia Gazis, always appreciate your very detailed reporting and analysis with some very interesting details there I did think to myself, Olivia, he's using the paper tiger analogy in the wrong part of the world, because the Russians have always seen themselves as bears, not tigers. That would be Asia. But Eurasia, maybe that's what he's thinking. Give the president the benefit of the doubt. Olivia Gazis, my friend, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk to CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand, who's at the White House this morning for us. So, as we've been talking about, Natalie, yesterday President Trump said Ukraine could win back its territory from Russia. And you heard Volodymyr Zelenskyy there at the United Nations saying that he had a very productive discussion with the President of the United States. Any other movement from the White House, any other statements about what they see as a path forward?
Well, that is the big and remains the big question. But just to take a step back for a second, the president's shift in tone and social media posts saying that Ukraine could potentially win back the lost territory came after this hour-long meeting with Zelenskyy yesterday on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And he did reference in his remarks today, Zelenskyy did, this good meeting with Trump, saying that, you know, they continue to count on the U.S. and allies, and also saying that weapons at the end of the day decides who survives. So the question is, following this post by the president, is there a pledge by this administration for more support? The post that the president made on social media references financial support of Europe and in particular NATO. But the president in his remarks before the UN General Assembly, also did issue another warning to Russia, saying in the event that Russia's not ready to make a deal to end the war, then the U.S. is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs. As we know, Vlad, that's something that's been discussed for weeks now, these potential secondary sanctions on countries like China that buy Russian energy and oil. The question is, at what point, will the president and this administration take that next step? We also know that the president yesterday urged the EU and European countries to stop buying any Russian oil, though they've tried to, ease off of dependence on Russian oil. Some countries are still purchasing. The president of the European Commission said that the EU agrees and wants to meet its goal of not buying any Russian energy ahead of its initial target of 2027.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of interesting, Natalie, because the president making an excellent point. But then in the same speech yesterday at the United Nations, the president also suggesting that Europe and the rest of the world should get off of green energy technology, including solar panels and including turbines, wind turbines. So if you're not able to get it from wind turbines or solar and you're not allowed to buy Russian oil, then what are people to do? I mean, I think that sort of was a conflict in the message that the president delivered.
Yeah, and going after Europe on the issue of energy, on immigration. But again, all of those headlines kind of are overshadowed by this new development with Ukraine and the question, what happens next?
All right. Thank you, Natalie Brand, and also thank you to Sam Vinograd and our Olivia Gazis for that excellent analysis of the last couple of days of the UN General Assembly. We've got continuing coverage of President Zelensky's remarks.